Hi guys, hope you're all doing well and welcome back to another video. Well, things are certainly hotting up where Myth of Empires is concerned. As I'm sure many of you probably already know, after an initially fantastic launch and initially positive reception to Myth of Empires, the game suddenly just disappeared from Steam on the 3rd of December, and it wasn't long before it became apparent that another game company had issued a DMCA takedown request against Myth of Empires. After some kind of initial speculation as to the identity of the game in question, it was quickly announced it was in fact Ark Survival Evolved and their parent company Snail Games and Studio Wildcard. Fast forward to the new year and still Myth of Empires is unavailable to purchase for new players on Steam or really anywhere else. And this is really obviously having a massively detrimental impact on the game. The players' population initially held up really quite well, but it obviously has been declining because loads of people want to get into the game, want to try it out, but are unable to purchase it at all. Thankfully, those who purchased the game on Steam prior to it being removed are still able to play, and the servers are still online, and the devs are still updating the game. But you can imagine, it's obviously not good for the developers. Well, in a big development today, Myth of Empires announced that they are essentially countersuing Snail Games and asking for a court judgment on the validity of the DMCA takedown request. But more than that, Myth of Empires has actually published their entire lawsuit request alongside the actual original DMCA letter sent to Steam by Snail Games, and it sure makes for some interesting reading. Firstly, I guess it's best to cover the original letter sent to Steam from Snail Games and Wildcard Studios. Now, I am by no means a lawyer, so I've had to read this post about 20 times to even start to understand it, but I did see a few interesting parts that I thought might be worth highlighting. Initially, Snail Games accuses Myth of Empires of stealing their game's source code. We already know this, of course, this is what's been talked about for a number of weeks now. But interestingly, they break this down to a few different parts, and they back it up by stating that a previous developer who had access to the code and worked on Ark Survival Evolved left to establish Myth of Empires as a studio, and that's basically how they stole the code and took it with them. At the back of the letter, they then go on to list multiple examples of similar or copied class, variable and function names. It's pretty difficult for a non-coder like me to really determine how similar a lot of these lines of code are. So I'd actually be kind of really interested to hear your thoughts on that. I'll link to the document in the description and comments down below so you can go over and have a look yourself. Particularly if you're a coder, what does it look like to you? Does it look copied or does it just look similar? Because that was one of the things that struck me, was that if a staff member who'd previously coded on Ark Survival Evolved then worked on Myth of Empires, it's perhaps not surprising that they laid out or wrote their code in a similar way. Kind of in my mind, an example or an analogy for this would be if you asked a secretary to write out a letter for two different companies. It wouldn't be that surprising if they then laid out that letter in a similar way for both companies. It's not that the secretary stole the letter layout from the first company, but more that that's just the way that that person lays out the letter. And would that not be similar with how you code? I don't know. Maybe a bad analogy, but that's just how it played out slightly in my mind. The letter then goes on to be really quite threatening towards Steam themselves, stating that Valve are essentially aiding illegal activity by hosting Myth of Empires, and that if they didn't immediately remove the game from Steam, they would be liable not only for indirect copyright infringement, but also trade secret misappropriation. Given that Steam probably couldn't really be confident either way in this case as to what's actually going on, it's not that surprising that they backed down and removed Myth of Empires from sale. I mean, I suppose, what choice did they really have? This then leads us onto the Myth of Empires counter lawsuit against Snail Games and Wildcard Studios. Firstly, the case is actually scheduled for a hearing on the 31st of January, so we really haven't got all that long to wait to see how this goes down, and I'll certainly be covering it once we get to that date, so do subscribe to keep up to date with the latest news on this. Myth of Empires are initially seeking a preliminary injunction against Snail Games' DMCA takedown request, which would essentially allow Myth of Empires to get their game back on Steam and back up for sale. They state that the allegations that were submitted by Snail Games and Wildcard Studios that Myth of Empires sort of quote-unquote stole their source code is false, and that the evidence submitted by Snail Games in their DMCA takedown request is insufficient and misleading, and that Snail Games and Wildcard Studios should be forced basically to remove their DMCA takedown and not interfere with the future sort of sales of Myth of Empires in any way. But actually, it goes further than that, because Myth of Empires goes on to state that Snail Games knowingly misrepresented the facts to get Myth of Empires removed from Steam, so that it couldn't be sold, and presumably so that it could be less of a threat to Ark Survival Evolved. They therefore feel Snail Games are sort of liable for the damages and losses caused to Myth of Empires, during the time that it was removed from Steam, and that Snail Games and Wildcard Studios should therefore be made to pay for these in full along with all the legal costs. Well, it's certainly a little bit of a mind twister getting your head around all that. It certainly took me a few read-throughs to understand a little bit what was going on. But it is honestly a really hard one to judge. Either way, and whatever the outcome of this, someone is going to end up losing quite badly. If the judge finds in favour of Snail Games and that Myth of Empires did in fact steal source code from Ark Survival Evolved, then that really is the end of Myth of Empires. It won't be returning to Steam, and it may even be removed from players' Steam libraries. However, on the other foot, if the judge finds in favour of Myth of Empires, then I would expect that Snail Games and Wildcard Studios are going to end up with a pretty hefty bill. May even be enough to send them under. It's not going to be a lot of fun for whoever loses. Honestly, personally, I don't know which side of the fence to sit on. Initially, I think I was more on the side of Myth of Empires, but as more and more stuff has come out, it's really kind of muddied the water. And obviously, the two games do have some similarities. And it is certainly the case that some developers left Snail Games to move and start working on Myth of Empires. I'd expect that as things develop though, the Myth of Empires source code is probably going to get examined in more detail, looked at a bit closer, and then kind of the true evidence will start to come to light. At least from the evidence we have so far, there is obviously some stuff to suggest that some parts of the code could be copied, but is it going to be enough to convince a judge that Myth of Empires essentially stole their source code? I guess that's what we're going to have to wait and see, but it's certainly going to make for an interesting case. But what are your thoughts on this one? Do you think Snail Games have made this up in an attempt to prevent Myth of Empires from selling the game, or has Myth of Empires been nabbing little bits of code from Ark Survival Evolved to save themselves having to write out the whole game from scratch? Either way, I'll certainly be following this one closely. If anything else happens between now and the 31st of January court date, I'll be sure to let you know, and obviously we'll cover the result from the initial hearing. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Do let me know any comments down below, and of course subscribe to the channel for lots more Myth of Empires news. Thanks for watching guys, I shall see you all on the next one.